Well, we knew Rishi Sunak was desperate, didn't we? What with the Tories' popularity being somewhere between cholera and tuberculosis. They're about 26 points behind at the moment, depends on the poll, admittedly, but there's a consistent theme across the polls. They are in a bit of a mess, to say the least. Rishi Sunak's own personal ratings have completely imploded. They've basically followed the Liz Truss trajectory, not quite as bad, but basically follow the trajectory of the British economy under Liz Truss. So, little précis of the Tories. They've had one PM turfed out in disgrace less than a year ago, way less than a year ago. It has been a long period we've lived through, I appreciate that. Turfed out in disgrace. Then we had another one turfed out in disgrace after setting fire to the economy. The government obviously now being rocked by multiple scandals, ranging from tax affairs to alleged serial bullying. Living standards suffering the worst squeeze in history, literally since records began. That's right, worse than 1910s, 1880s. It's not ideal, is it? Worst growth of the major industrialised nations. They're responding with more austerity, which people are not that keen on after having endured about 13 years of it, with the public realm reduced to tatters. So, obviously, with that context, they keep pressing a big red shiny button with culture war on it, as well as transphobia and demonise refugees in an attempt to deflect people's anger. It's the old kind of Tory ruse. The Tories have always done this. Like, if you go back to, I think it was 1906, the Tories introduced the Aliens Act to try and whip up fear about Jewish migrants and refugees from Eastern Europe. They like to deflect people's anger, get people to blame all the wrong people, not people who are powerful, who are in charge, but people who are desperate. Now, with that context, what's Rishi Sunak's latest little ploy to turn things around? He's appointed Lee Anderson as vice chair of the Conservative Party. Lee Anderson. Let's talk about Lee Anderson. Now, a little caveat. Last time I spoke about Lee Anderson, he went on GB News and alleged that I fancy him. That's right. Perfectly normal, reasonable politician. Comment from a politician being scrutinised, of course, to allege that a gay journalist actually fancies them. Just to put on the record, to be very clear, Lee Anderson, mate, you're not actually my type. Just want to make that very clear. I appreciate you may be the type of others. Lots of people have little niche tastes, and that is up to them. Now, Lee Anderson's one of the most right-wing, obnoxiously right-wing Tory MPs. He used to be a Labour councillor. Seriously, until 2018, after he received a community protection warning by the council for using boulders to block members of the traveller community from setting up a camp. I say this because sometimes when you talk about the Labour right, and the Labour right is a concept which has been widely understood ever since the Labour Party existed. I mean, there are people on the Labour right, like Luke Akehurst, who sits on the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party. He calls himself the Labour right. But sometimes you go, oh, you're just demonising people who have different opinions to you. Everyone's left of centre with the Labour Party. Lee Anderson was in the Labour Party for absolute donkeys until finally he tried to use boulders to block travellers. Then that was, he was suspended, and then he defected to the Conservatives. Who's to say he would have just stayed in the Labour Party otherwise? You do get people like that in the Labour Party. There's a whole host of others. People who ended up like Ian Austin and other former Labour MPs just become ridiculously right-wing caricatures. Anyway. Now, Sam Coates, the Sky News journalist, got a slightly upset message from a Tory saying, Lee Anderson's everything that's wrong with the Conservative brand presently. He seems to rejoice in deliberately provoking and making aggressive, simplistic statements that fail to recognise the complexities of the issues facing the country. If this is the new Tory party, many will be forgiven for deserting it. You can use more precise language. He's a troll. He's an internet troll. That's what he is. He's a troll who's become an MP. He's the MP for Troll Central. That's what he does. He exists to troll people. He doesn't exist to... his function as a politician isn't to try and offer some hopeful, inspiring vision of what the country could look like. It's to rile people. It's to get people angry and upset. He's a troll. That's the whole point. Now, in the 2019 election, Michael Crick, the journalist, was with him. He was going around with other MPs. It's the most Alan Partridge thing you can do. I don't know if anyone remembers that episode of Alan Partridge where he does something similar with a fan. Actually, it doesn't went out well for Alan Partridge because the fan ends up being completely obsessed with him and having multiple tattoos of him and essentially kidnaps him. Anyway, but he says, Lee Anderson, to this guy, don't just make out you don't, make out you don't know who I am. Make out you know who I am, that you know I'm the candidate but not a friend. All right, sorry, that was the point. So he wanted him to be like, he knows who he is but pretend he's not a friend because he's actually a friend of Lee Anderson. I'm in the car park, have a quick look. Yeah, all right, see you in a minute. Blimey. So then this resident opens the door and then starts praising Anderson's calls for nuisance council tenants to be housed in tents, forced to wake up at 6 a.m. to pick vegetables and then doused in cold showers. Anderson ends up, this is reported by the New Statesman at the time, I'd put the video clip up, but they'll probably claim ownership and I can't be bothered, saying that the man said he was too soft and it suggests a cat of nine tails and putting them in a pink tutu. So then Lee Anderson's embarrassed and just stops the whole thing altogether. Lee Anderson went on to boycott the England game because England football players took the knee as an expression of anti-racism. He said they are supporting a political movement whose core principles aim to undermine our very way of life. Well, I mean, what do you mean by our way of life? For the England players, anti-racism is core to their way of life. I mean, this is the thing about how the right construe patriotism, isn't it? Because, well, they'll denounce the left for being unpatriotic and then they'll boycott the national game of their own football team because they stand against racism. I mean, that's what happened, isn't it? Not actually. That's what happened. And I think again, which way of life are you talking about? I don't. His nature, his definition of English identity or British identity is obviously not one I share because obviously anti-racism, fighting prejudice, bigotry. People throughout history who fought against racism and bigotry. People who fought for the rights of women, LGBTQ people, all the rest of it. That's my way of life. That's my view of kind of British identity. Not Lee Anderson's. Anyway, he went on to blame people in poverty and hunger in Britain on not being able to budget properly, goading them, basically going on about how they can make nutritious meals for 30p. Easy for an MP who's on over £84,000 a year, isn't it, to talk in those terms, particularly when they support policies which have driven people into misery, insecurity, poverty and hardship. Easy to just blame the individual. I mean, that's what Thatcherism did. She once said, there was no such thing as primary poverty in this country. There's the individual character defect of people being unable to budget properly. When obviously the reality is people forced to struggle in a rich country because they're in hardship. He also went to battle with nurses. Oh, I'm glad nurses finally are getting a bit of scrutiny. The nurses who carried this country through its worst crisis of World War II, alleging that any nurse going to a food bank, that's a failure of budgeting on their part. Obnoxious, just a troll. Now, just finally on this, because I think basically Rishi Sunak, who once said when he was younger that he had no working class friends, I think his image of working class people is basically Lee Anderson. It's like a guy in his 50s, 60s, how old is Lee Anderson? Anyway, 50s or so, 60s, who says just horrible things. And that's, just knuckle draggers. That's what he thinks. That's his view, I think, of like he's put an authentically working class person who speaks and thinks like working class people in this country. Not how people I grew up with spoke and thought. They didn't say terrible things about nurses and people have been driven into poverty and hardship. Lots of them lived in poverty and hardship, to be fair. So it's just this idea, isn't it? This caricature, which is, you've got this all the time in kind of like vox pops where they'll go, anyone who's working class, they're not people who work, I don't know, like a young black worker in Tesco's or whatever, or, someone working for delivery or whatever. It always has to be often someone who's retired, and not all pensioners by any means have these sorts of views, I should be very clear about that, who says bad things about people, which are kind of nasty. That's not how millions of working class people think or feel. And I think Tories are going to find that out, actually. I think people are fed up with this nonsense, just being trolled by obnoxious, overpaid Tory politicians who've given up any sense. Thatcher had a vision of society, didn't like it, it's ugly and horrible. Look, we're living in the consequences of it. But she had a vision of society. This lot, just trolls, just trolling people. They don't have a view of how the country should be run. They don't have a vision. They just are left using the bully pulpit to troll, provoke, and irritate. And that is politics for them. I don't think it's going to end very well for them. As I've said, I think people are fed up. Please like, subscribe, support us on patreon.com/OJoseFul. I'll see you soon.